So our vision at CMT is to focus on EDM, evangelism, disciple making, mission mobilization. And I know the ministries that you're a part of, that you're leading, are training students to share their faith. And so what are kind of your primary go-to strategies and tools for evangelism and getting students sharing their faith?
Yeah, great question, Paul. When I think about just creating a movement that's committed to sharing the gospel. I mean, I think two things come to mind. One is you gotta build conviction. There's got to be a desire, kind of an intrinsic heart, to want to share the gospel. And honestly, I think the greatest way to instill that intrinsic desire is when your students have been won to the Lord from the lost world themselves. In other words, you don't have to train it into them if it's been bred, into them. And I think for us, from just a ministry philosophy, standpoint, we really are wanting to put our primary energies, initially and each year, and anytime we start a new campus, we want to focus on really pioneering. We want to focus on reaching, the lost. Now, of course, any university is going to have 3, 5, 7% of students that are going to come to campus and they're looking for spiritual input. They're looking for growth.
Right.
But the reality is a lot of times it's tempting as a ministry to put 95% of your energy into that 5%, of the students. And all the ministries tend to kind of be competing and doing that. And so we've just said, we want to kind of do the opposite. We want to put 95% of our energy into the 95%, of the students on campus that aren't looking for spiritual growth, that aren't looking to get plugged in, aren't looking, for fellowship. And so then a lot of times our movements really begin with those who have come to faith. Maybe they've had some sort of a spiritual background, but they're coming to faith on the campus and within the movement. And what we found is at that point, training, those men and women, and subsequently, our staff as well, probably 95% of our staff came to Christ, in college. The training isn't as difficult because they get it intuitively. They understand the importance of integrating your life with your non-Christian friends because someone integrated their life, with them. They understand that evangelism is a process. It's not just a one-time event because they see in their own journey, just like it was for me. It was months and months of David doing life with me and getting me in the scriptures. And so much of that conviction, if you will, I think can really be rooted in our own experience and in our own journey, towards Christ ourselves. So we want to create conviction. And in addition to that being bred into us, you go back to the scriptures, you see the heart of God, you see the purpose of God, you see the ultimate mission of God and how that achieves the glory of God. And it builds a burden, to be about the lost. And then second, maybe more briefly than that, I would just say in addition to conviction, you got to create a culture. It's not just having a conviction that wants to share the gospel, but it's also creating a culture that prioritizes it. And so we really do, it's not the only thing we're focused on, but we really do prioritize evangelism. We prioritize it, again, in the energy of our staff. We're instilling, that as a priority into the student leaders and really recognizing that that's not where ministry ends, but it really should be where ministry and where the Great Commission begins. And so we kind of use this analogy of pioneering and parenting and partnering. And we just recognize that there's a progression in ministry, but we really want to create a culture that begins with pioneering.
And that particular illustration, I call it the 4 Ps, Joel, because it has a fourth P, pioneering, parenting, partnering, but then participating, where you are backing out. This is a parenting podcast tonight also, Paul, where you're gradually backing out, and now they're living their life and doing their ministry, and you're simply a resource, a participant.